Welcome, everyone. I'm Cheryl Landrew. I'm the director of the New Orleans Book Festival at Tulane University. I'm so honored to be here tonight for the Presidential Speaker Series with President Mike Fitz. Tonight's session features two nationally renowned guests who happen to be New Orleans natives. I want to just take a moment to thank President Fitz for his extraordinary leadership during this time, and also to thank him for bringing us all together tonight for a very exciting and provocative conversation. Thank you. President Fitz.
Sorry, now I'm unmuted now. Anyway, thank you, Cheryl. First of all, thank you for all that you've done for Book Fest at Tulane and pivoting to a virtual Book Fest when COVID came upon us. And I know you're fast at work with your co-conspirator, Walter Isaacson, setting up next year's Book Fest. So again, thank you for all of that. It's one of the great events and one of the great series here at Tulane University. So thank you all, and I'd like to welcome everybody. I hope you're well and socially isolating at this moment in time. And this really is, I think, an extraordinary evening we have. It's part, as Cheryl said, part of the presidential series, speaker series, where we bring individuals who have been part of and made history to talk about the events that they shaped and shaped their lives, and talk about important issues of the day. Our first presidential speaker was a law school classmate of mine, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Sonia Sotomayor, who really gave a sort of a riveting description of her life and overcoming adversity and insights into not only our society, but the legal profession. And today we have two people who each are icons, who again have been part of and made history, and are really give incredible insight into an issue which is paramount in our country today, racism and anti-racism and how to combat it. And that obviously will be a large part of our conversation today. It gives me great pleasure, first of all, to introduce Ruby Bridges, who is, an author, an activist, an educational consultant, and the head of the foundation that she established. And of course, at age 6, she was essentially the first Black to integrate an elementary school in the United States, in the South. And it was truly part of history and truly captured in the great Norman Rockwell painting. And as sort of, there are a lot of things I could say about it, but President Obama probably said it all when he welcomed her to the White House, and they looked at the picture and he said, it probably is the case that but for your actions, I wouldn't be president of the United States today. So it truly is a pleasure to welcome you here today. Secondly, we have, and great pleasure, Marc Morial, one of the great civil rights leaders in the United States. He is president and CEO of the largest civil rights organization in the country, the National Urban League, and is now overseeing really an exciting agenda about economic equality, as well as confronting health disparities, which have really been illuminated by COVID-19. He's a 2-term mayor of New Orleans, where he was president of the National Conference of Mayors. There are many connections between all of our, both of our speakers today. But one I learned when I spoke to Marc was that it was his father, Dutch Morial, who was one of the lawyers on the case that originally was brought that led to the desegregation of the school. So truly a connection that goes way back. I also want to point out that Marc's mother, Sybil Morial, a distinguished educator in her own right, after she graduated from Boston University, came to Tulane, and I understand it was a dare from your dad. She literally enrolled at Tulane School of Social Work, and they did not realize that she was Black, but they found it out 2 weeks later, and literally asked her to leave. Obviously, a black mark on all of us. But one of my great joys as president of Tulane University was my ability to give her an honorary alumnus award several years ago. So she is an alumnus of Tulane University. So anyway, welcome to you both. I want to start out with you, Ruby. And I must say, years ago when I was a law student, I took a year off from law school and worked with one of my mentors, Judge Leon Higginbotham, on a book that he wrote about race in the American legal process, 200 years. And what I must say impacted me when I read through that history is not only how important the law was, but how important the process was around the law, the politics, the social movements. And when I think of the fact that you were born in the year of Brown versus Board of Education, but literally you were desegregating the William Frantz School 6 years later, it really illustrates the importance of the fact that it was you who made Brown real and gave it a reality. So I want to, for you to, in a sense, set the stage for all of us. What was it like as a 6-year-old going into that school?
Well, I have to say that being 6 and not really knowing anything about racism at the time, which I always like to point out, none of our 6-year-olds know anything about racism at that age. I had already attended school, so I was aware of what school was like. I had gone to kindergarten at an all-Black school that was further away from my house. We lived in the Ninth Ward, very close to where William Frantz School is, but I was attending Johnson Lockett at the time for kindergarten, which was, all Black. Everybody there looked exactly like me. My teachers, the principal, all of the kids. And so it was the way things were back then. But again, the NAACP was spearheading this movement, and they did a door-to-door search. My parents I was actually born in Mississippi. My parents were also, and they were sharecroppers. And I always like to point out that, for them, being able to go to school was a luxury for them. I mean, if it was time for them to get the crops in, then they were not allowed to go to school. And so they moved from Mississippi to New Orleans. And I think when that knock came at the door, asking them if they would be willing to send their 6-year-old to one of these integrated schools for the first time in the city, they jumped at the opportunity. I think what they saw is that it was an opportunity for them to allow their kids to have something that they couldn't have, and that was a better education. And so they never tried to explain anything to me. It's important for me too to point out that being raised during that time in an African-American family, pretty much, I always tell my students when I'm speaking to them, it truly was a different day and a different time. You were pretty much seen, but not heard. So, it was a time when they wouldn't have sat me down and said, this is what's happening. And, is it something that you want to do? That didn't happen at all. The only thing they said to prepare me is, Ruby, you're going to go to a new school today and you better behave. And pretty much that's what I was concentrating on. it was very strange for me because even though I'd gone to school, this particular first day was very different. There was a knock at the door, and, you know, 4 very tall white men were standing there and basically saying, you know, we're here to escort you and your daughter to school today. We've been sent by the President of the United States. And so for me, that was different. Even though I had had a first day, this was a totally different first day. I knew something was going on because there was so much talk around the whole event. It's my understanding that there were nearly 150 kids that parents volunteered to send them. And all of those kids had to be tested. And I distinctly remember taking the test because it was actually the very first time that I'd left my neighborhood and gone into a different neighborhood. It was the first time that I had ever taken the streetcar. So those little things stuck out in my mind. And I remember going uptown and sitting in this room with lots of kids. And I now know it was 150 odd kids, and taking a test that took all day long, didn't know anything about what it was about. Took the streetcar back home, and a few weeks later found out that I was going to be attending this new school and that I was so smart and only 6 kids were able to pass the test. What I know now is that the test was really set up to eliminate kids. And so it was 6 kids that actually passed. There were all girls. 3 girls were assigned to one school, which was John McDonald 19, if I'm not mistaken, and 3 to William Frantz Elementary. By the time the first day came, 2 kids had dropped out, and they were assigned to go to William Frantz, which was the school that I was assigned to go to. And so that's how I ended up in one school alone, and the other 3 girls went to John McDonald 19. So it was truly very different from my kindergarten first day. I remember getting into the car with them and, you know, starting this very short drive to William Frantz. And by the time we turned the corner, I saw, you know, just crowds and crowds of people standing out in front of the school. And they were screaming and yelling and shouting and, you know, waving their hands and throwing things. There were signs everywhere. But, you know, living here in New Orleans and being accustomed to Mardi Gras, I remember turning that corner and thinking, today is Mardi Gras. You know, we're caught in the midst of a parade. I mean, we all know that that happens. You turn a corner and there's a parade and you have to sit there and wait until it passes. And that's actually, in my 6-year-old mind, that's what I saw and that's what was happening. You know, having taken the test and having people come over to my house and congratulate my parents and talk about how smart I was, I actually thought that the test that I took, that everybody else failed except these 6 girls, meant that I could now go from kindergarten straight to college. So in my mind, I guess I was on my way to Tulane University. But that truly was not the case. And so I remember being rushed into the building and escorted to the principal's office, where I sat all day. And parents that were outside, white parents, they rushed in and they actually went into every classroom and pulled out every child. So that's what my first day of school was like.
All I can say is wow. So I want to get to Mark in a second, but just sort of quickly, what was that first year like in the classroom and the people come outside, at least in the beginning, every day?
Well, you know, there were teachers who actually quit their jobs because they refused to teach Black kids. And my teacher came from Boston, and the fact that they had gone into the school the first day and taken their kids out, I was the only student in my class. I do believe there were 4 or 5 other kids, parents that tried to cross that picket line. They were never allowed to be in my classroom. I could hear them. I never saw them. And indeed, what was happening is that the principal, who was also part of the opposition, decided that she would hide those kids. And so I would never see them, and they would never see me. I distinctly remember that because I remember hearing kids, but I never saw them. So I have to say, you know, the worst thing about first grade for me was being 6 and not having friends, and it was the loneliness. But, you know, I had an amazing teacher who actually cared about me, and, you know, so much so, I think that we realized that we had to be at school. And so she never missed a day, and neither did I. You know, she actually did everything she could to keep my mind off of what was happening outside. And she managed to make school fun. So that's sort of what my first year there was like.
I can't say, I can't imagine what level of fortitude it took for a 6-year-old to go through that. And obviously we're all in your debt, the entire society is. Marc, you grew up in New Orleans about the same time. Do you want to talk a little bit about your experiences?
Yeah, I will.
Bit
And I'm so honored to be with you, President Fitz, and of course, with the legend Ruby Bridges, whose name I've known since I was very young. I was born in '58 and first attended school in 1963, fall of 1963. And it was the second year the schools that I attended in the neighborhood I was in was integrated. And we had to travel from Pontchartrain Park, which was an all-black neighborhood where I grew up, through a ditch over to the white neighborhood to attend school. What I recall is the day before I was to go to school, my mother took me to meet 2 other families because there were 2 other black boys who were going to be in my class. And we were told that we were to walk to school together and walk home together and not leave each other. We went into the classroom in kindergarten, I remember, and they sat us all at the same little table for 3 children in the back of the class. And that's where we sat through the entire first year. What was traumatic a little bit about those days is that, you know, we were constantly called the N-word, right? And typically it was not by classmates, it was by older children who would see us lined up and walk by and say, oh, when did they allow N's in this school? So you went through that experience in those days. Now, my father was a civil rights lawyer in those days, and you referenced it, President Fitz. He was a protege of the legendary A.P. Turo, who brought the case called Bush versus Orleans Parish Schools in 1947, which is when the NAACP was the NAACP's principal lawyer in Louisiana. My father finished law school in '54, started practicing in '56, and joined Turo in his practice. And at that time, the Bush case had gained a little bit of a new momentum because of the Brown versus the Board of Education decision. And so, you know, we learned about Ruby and the 4 girls in 1960, Ruby and the other 3 girls who went to McDown in 19 at a very, very early age. But in those days, the resistance to school desegregation was very assertive. It was very aggressive. And I'll give you a New Orleans footnote about this. I talked about this when I was down. 1956, 2 years after Brown, a year or so after Brown, a year and a half after Brown, the Catholic Archbishop of New Orleans, by the name of Joseph Rummel, tried to integrate the Catholic schools in New Orleans, tried to order them to be integrated. He issued this pastoral encyclical that was read in all the churches that said that segregation was absolutely wrong, and he sought to integrate the schools and faced a very aggressive backlash from white families, white parents, benefactors of the church. Rummel actually was a German-American immigrant who had spent his early years as a Catholic priest in Harlem before he came to New Orleans. There's an interesting footnote about Rummel is that in 1962 and 1963, he actually excommunicated several prominent, including one of the most prominent segregationist politicians by the name of Leander Perez. He excommunicated him from the Catholic Church because of his out and out criticism. Perez had sought to lead a boycott of the Catholic Church, telling people not to donate. I offer this context around what was going on in New Orleans in 1960. You had the sit-ins taking place at the Woolworth drugstore. The Freedom Ride that John Lewis participated in terminated in New Orleans. And those Freedom Riders who came to New Orleans as students were actually housed very quietly at Xavier University by Norman Francis, who was then the Dean of Men. So there was a whole series of things. New Orleans' involvement in civil rights is not as well known as it ought to be because its role was quite significant. And you know, Ruby and the courage that she exhibited, but I think the story of Ruby was also the courage she exhibited, but it was the face of the opposition, the parents who were picketing, the parents who took their kids out of school, the teachers who refused to teach, the legislators in Louisiana who, in response to federal court orders of desegregation, said, we'll shut the schools down.
Right.
We'll end public education. So every positive act towards justice, many times, and we see that on the landscape, in the landscape today, is met with this vicious and sort of vigorous and angry reaction. And it took many, many people, many, many years of goodwill to face that down. And that's, you know, if you look at those photos and those newspaper articles and some of the documentaries that have done, it was amazing to me that Ruby had to walk a gauntlet of screaming and yelling parents, hurling epithets at a little girl. Why would federal marshals have to escort someone to school? Because it simply wasn't safe.
So what is so instructive is that you were both individuals who were there at one of the most horrible points in the civil rights history of the United States, and were, you know, deeply involved, you, your parents, in that change, and have lived through an incredible period of time, have insights about it. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't note that John Lewis passed away this past week, and clearly was someone who was deeply involved, like you, in the civil rights movement from the beginning to today. And I just want to give you both an opportunity. I know he's a great figure in both your lives. One of my greatest moments was the ability to give him an honorary degree at Tulane University. Wow. And he got a standing ovation from 15,000 people at the Superdome. So I just want to, if you could comment a little bit about.
Go ahead, Ruby.
Well, you know, even though I knew of John Lewis, like Dr. King, I didn't meet him until actually 2005, right? Well, not 2005, it must have been the next year, right after Hurricane Katrina, when, you know, they would lead this pilgrimage to civil rights sites. And as Marc said, you know, New Orleans definitely was one of those sites. And so it was he and other congressmen that actually came, and we did a bus tour of the Ninth Ward. And we spent several days together seeing some of the sites, and we had an opportunity to go and visit France School and also McDonald 19. And then we ended up at Leah Chase's place for dinner, and he and I had an opportunity to kind of speak to the group together. I was so moved by him. It was, I mean, it's always an honor when you can sit shoulder to shoulder with someone like that and actually be able to kind of pick their brain and ask them questions. And so it meant the world to me. And so after that, every 2 years or so, I would go on that trip with them, and we would go to Selma, and we would actually reenact the walk across the bridge. And so my last trip this year, before the shutdown, was actually with him. We were all there again in Selma. He wasn't able to really walk very far, but he drove up and got out of the van. He grabbed our arms and walked across the bridge and turned and looked at us and said, "I have to say that I think this is going to be the last time that I walk this bridge." It was a very, very sad moment. We could see that he was ill, but to think, you know, he was still dedicated to the very, very end, just dedicated his whole life. I just think that that's amazing. I mean, we all know, and I'm sure Marc will agree, that when you answer a call, calling isn't just a job. It's something that you accept, and you never give up on it. You're in it for life. I heard one of the Little Rock Nine women, who Minnie Jean Brown, who's a good friend of mine, said it's a life sentence. That's what it is. And he dedicated his whole life to this fight. And I just think that it's just amazing that the end of his life is right here at this moment in time where we are right now. You know, for me, 60 years later, you know, this new movement that I think all of us who have been in this fight have been waiting for a very, very long time. But that's my memory of John Lewis.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just offer these observations. Michelle and I saw John Lewis last December. It's the last time I saw him. Michelle was moderating a panel, and he was the principal speaker at the Library of Congress in connection with the opening of an exhibit on the life of Rosa Parks. And I remember, because we've known John Lewis a long time, and he's been to National Urban League events numerous times. He hosted a fundraiser for me with Andy Young and Maynard Jackson in Atlanta the first time I ran for office in 1990. Can't say I knew him intimately or well, but was always friendly and supportive. And I remember commenting to Michelle, I said, "John looks tired tonight. He doesn't seem to have his usual fire and zip and zap." And I noticed it just looked like he had lost a couple of pounds, that he was ill. I thought nothing of it except he was just maybe having a tough day or just was tired. but certainly we know now it was probably the beginning of the diagnosis of cancer. What stands out for me when I think of John Lewis is that he was a student activist. He was, an original freedom rider. He was the president of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was a speaker at the march as a 22, 23-year-old young man. He represented the energy of the youth wing of the civil rights movement, remembering, of course, that Martin King was in his early 30s in 1963, and Whitney Young was in his late 30s, and Roy Wilkins was a bit older, and A.F.A. Philip Randolph was a bit older, but many of the leaders, Andrew Young and Hosea Williams and Ralph David Abernathy, they were young men by the standards of how we think about leadership in many instances today. John was even younger, and he represented the energy of the youth and the passion of the youth and to some extent the intelligent militancy of the youth in those days. But he also represented something else I think is important, is the transition of many civil rights leaders and civil rights activists who transitioned their work to local, state, and national politics. John Lewis became an Atlanta City Councilman and then a member of Congress. Andrew Young became a congressman and then an ambassador to the United Nations and then mayor of Atlanta. My father, who'd been a civil rights lawyer, became a legislator, a judge, and then mayor. And then numerous instances around the country. And I remember my father always saying that, a prerequisite for running for office from the standpoint of he and his allies like Revius Ortique and Israel Augustine was, had someone paid their dues in civil rights. And if they hadn't been involved in civil rights, they had no right to ask the community to put them in elected office. And it was kind of a principal thing with he and his friends and his allies in politics. I'd always hear them speak in that fashion because there was a belief that the ballot box and the power that came with elected office was a way to continue the work of civil rights. John Lewis represented that. And then John Lewis also stood out because for his fire, for his passion, for his courage and his unyielding insistence. He was a gracious, charming personality, a very approachable, down-to-earth man, a man who carried himself with this, this pride and this sense of leadership, but not with a sense of arrogance or haughtiness or snootiness or I'm better than thou. And I think that personal quality, you study leaders and you observe leaders, is why he's such a role model and why his legacy is going to last forever.
Absolutely. I agree.
I must say that was beautiful. I think you captured John Lewis perfectly from at least from the times I met him. And it's not just the legendary figure, but it's just the human being, a wonderful, humble human being, which was so amazing given who he was. You both lived through, sort of said, the beginnings of the civil rights movement, through its evolution through today, and we've had I would say hundreds of questions. And I'm obviously going to only have an opportunity to read a few, but Ruby's comments really prompted me to want to ask about this connection between your experience at the early civil rights movement and right now. And Gadi Kamara, who's a student at Tulane, asked, what is the difference you notice about the first civil rights movement and the Black Rights Matter movement today?
Well, for me, I think, as I said earlier, it's sort of the 60-year span of time, and like Marc pointed out, all of those leaders during the first civil rights movement, John Lewis and Abernathy and King and C.T. Vivian and, you know, Marc's father and so many people who put in all of that work, allowed us an opportunity to sort of bring, for me, because I always say that my experience comes from that of a child. And it allowed all of our kids over the 60-year span of time to actually come together. It allowed them to be in schools together. It allowed them to work together in the workplace, to play sports together. It allowed all of those people to have an opportunity to get to know one another, which was, I believe, part of King's dream. And even though we've all felt like, you know, there's so much more work to do, but the work that all of those people before us put in allowed us to do that in that 60-year span of time. And so what I see that's different today from what I saw back then is that when you look at what we see in the streets today, you know, they're Black, brown, white, Asian, you know, they're all different nationalities and they're out there in the streets together. And I think for people probably like myself, Marc, and all those people that we just mentioned, who put in all that work, and I even heard John Lewis say it, and President Obama, I mean, that's what we want. That's what we've always wanted. You know, it's like all of a sudden, and I guess that's what I meant when I said, in a sense, losing John when we did, at least he had an opportunity to kind of see the fruits of his labor, you know, by seeing what we see today that's taken to the streets. So for me, what is very, very different is that, you know, our young people now understand that it really doesn't matter about the color of your skin. You know, that we're all in this fight together. We have to be to win. And I'm extremely proud of that. You know, I chose to work with kids because my experience comes from that of a child. And I've always felt that if we were to really get past our racial differences, it truly was going to come from our children. And so I'm actually very hopeful about what I see in the streets today. And I think it speaks to all the work that all those people, all those civil rights leaders put in many, many years ago.
Yeah, thank you, Ruby. That's you captured a great essence, and I would only add by saying that there's similarities and differences. So the civil rights movement of the 60s and the 50s always had white allies. But Ruby's absolutely right. The protests you've seen in the street are different. The spontaneity of the outrage, the protests taking place in Iowa, not just in big cities, not just in the South, but Iowa and villages and hamlets in New Hampshire, and just a spontaneous movement that exceeds the bounds of politics. Because like the 1960s, as it transformed, it's animating, if you will, animating force is a sense of right and wrong, a sense of morality, which means it has the power to move others, the power to move mighty institutions like businesses, and to move politicians, and to move people It's a movement of consciousness. What is different is that in the 1960s, civil rights advocates clearly believed that the president was on their side or not against them. Whether it was even Dwight David Eisenhower, who sent federal troops to Little Rock and signed the 1957 Civil Rights Act, while Eisenhower was no burning champion of civil rights, there was no sense that General Eisenhower was anti-civil rights and would align himself with the rhetoric of the Leander Perez's and the Lester Maddoxes and the Richard Russells and the Southern politicians who were anti-civil rights and art segregationists. Today, there's no question that no one believes that the President of the United States is an ally of the Black Lives Matter movement, that he's aligned himself with the moral force of change that's sweeping the streets. That's a very different. What is similar is that in the 1960s, protesters were attacked. Attacked on the bridge in Selma is the most celebrated place, but attacked in many instances for peaceful protests. We may have thought that the idea that peaceful protesters would be attacked is taboo. Now you see the President of the United States sending in a squad of, I don't know what they are, a squad of military personnel from the Department of Homeland Security to Portland to repel peaceful protesters in the streets of Portland. That's similar to the 1960s. The idea that the forces of law enforcement would somehow battle peaceful protesters, that they would turn tear gas on peaceful protesters because, quote unquote, they were violating a curfew or an order to disperse. That's very similar to what you saw in the 1960s. And Dr. King and others, there were court cases in Selma to force the state to give protesters a permit to be able to march. So we have similarities and we have differences. The question before us is this a movement or is it a moment? The 1960s were a movement, not a moment. When Ruby integrated France Elementary, it was a moment that was part of a movement. Is the death of George Floyd going to be a moment unto itself, or is it going to be a moment that's part of a movement? And those that are committed, of all backgrounds, have to work to sustain the momentum of this moral force, which is what the Black Lives Matter movement represents in this country. It's a moral force to end structural racism, but it's also a moral force for justice and fairness and tolerance and decency and against hatred, yes, against Black people, but hatred in all of its forms, all of its fashions, all of its iterations. All of these hatreds, whether it's anti-Semitism or anti-immigrant, being anti-immigrant or anti-Muslim or they're all fruit of the same poisonous tree. They're fruit of the same poisonous tree. And this movement today, I think we may be witnessing a new movement in America. The young people have to carry it. The college students at Tulane have to carry it. The consciousness of and the energy of young people and the work and the wisdom of elders.
Mark is right. I believe that, I said this early on, that, you know, they do have to stay committed. I mean, as we just spoke about John Lewis and all those people who dedicated their lives, they never gave up. That's what the young people have to do, because I really see it, like Mark says, if it is indeed a movement, it could definitely be a movement for world peace. Mm-hmm. And that sounds huge, but I mean, I believe that that's what they should be going for, because it is about so many different issues. And it's, you know, it may have started right here in this country, but as we see, it's all across the world. It's all across the world. And so they have to be committed and they have to keep the momentum. It actually has to become a movement across the world. And that's truly possible. I mean, I believe that it's possible.
Marc, question directed at you from a member of our faculty, Roseanne Adderley, who's thinking about how this affects the National Urban League. You know, how does it, in effect, change or shape your agenda?
Yeah.
Yes. How can an organization like the Urban League, how can it work best to converge with this 21st century civil rights activism?
We, you know, for us, it's energized our movement and our organization, because our organization is now made up of dynamic young leaders at the local level all across the nation. Our local leaders, whether it's Sadiqa Reynolds in Louisville, is on the tip of the spear in the fight for justice for Breonna Taylor. Our leader in Minneapolis is involved in police reimagination and reform, Steve Belton. Our leader in Atlanta, Nancy Flake Johnson, is working on the committee that's looking at reforming and changing and reimagining the Atlanta Police Department. At the national level, I've been knee deep, shoulders deep in the battle to pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, testifying before the House Judiciary Committee, working closely with other civil rights leaders, with the staff of members to basically write and design the bill. So this is an energizing movement for us. I think people have to understand that in a movement like this, there's a role that everyone must play. And this is not a movement like the 60s where there seems to be a superstructure of leadership leading the movement. And even in the 60s, while people said there was Dr. King and other top big six civil rights leaders, the truth is that the energy was everywhere. It was in the small communities where you had community leaders and NAACP presidents and student leaders following the cadence of the movement. They were not dialing up Dr. King in Atlanta to get permission to sit in at a lunch counter or to march on City Hall. There was a spontaneity, and that's what made it a movement. So for us, we're working to embrace the idea that this gives momentum to many of the public policy things we've worked on, and also gives greater support. I have received more calls offering support for the National Urban League's reentry programs in the last 6 weeks that I've received in the past 16 years. That's true. People who say, how can I help on criminal justice reform? How can I help on reentry? So there's an energy out there. And there's also, I think, young people who may embrace organizations. And what I do not participate in is organizational and generational rivalries. And I've seen some people in the media, particularly the high-end media, try to suggest, well, this group's at odds with that group and that. And you know what? I don't want to hear that because because it's counterproductive. And that type of wedge was used in the 60s.
Yeah.
It was exploited by sinister forces in the FBI to plant stories of battles and rivalries that created needless division. We can have our tactical debates internally, but this Black Lives Matter movement needs to remain a united front in purpose, a united front in direction. And I think it can embrace, Black people. And I think that there's a role for other people. And I think it's aligned with other movements for justice, and so I think this is where we are. And so we've really worked hard to step up. We'll be announcing an expansion of our reentry work very, very soon. We're working on it now. We will be announcing an expansion of our commitment to police reimagination and reform very, very soon. We've been working on those sorts of things. We've got a great, influential, strong affiliate in New Orleans, the Urban League of Louisiana, led by Judy Reese Morse, doing great reentry work, doing housing work, doing advocacy around many progressive issues. So this is a time when we recognize that we have to step up and meet the moment. We have to step up and provide leadership, but we have to also recognize that it is a movement of many leaders and many voices and many people, and we need to be mature enough and I think foresighted enough to recognize that.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, this is obviously an issue of large public policy. It's also an issue of conversations occurring across the country. And I just wanted to ask a question from one of our students, Rachel Hebert, who asked, how should we lead conversations with our peers regarding anti-racism to foster a more adapted and educated learning community? How is on an individual level, on a personal level, how do people confront racism?
I think just what we're doing right now. I mean, I think we all have to be involved in the conversation, and a real conversation where you're not made to feel uncomfortable, for whatever question you want to ask. For me, because I do work with young people, I've gotten so many people that have reached out and said, my kids are watching what's happening, and they're asking questions, and I don't really know how to explain it to them, and what should I be doing? And I'm really happy that they're asking those questions, because it makes me feel like you really want to be a part of this movement. And so many times, with our really young people, we sort of overlook them and not really want to get them involved. I believe that for a very, very long time, activism wasn't cool. And now we see all of a sudden, even the little ones, for me, I see that because I'm in school with them. The little ones, they want to become.
I think we may have lost Ruby.
I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes. We may have lost.
Yeah, I think that is the weather bad down there?
No, you're back. You're on mute, Ruby. We got to unmute. There you go.
Okay.
Right.
Go ahead, Ruby.
For a very, very long time, I believe that our kids really needed a cause to get behind. I have to say that I was so moved when, I was disheartened at first, because it was a shame that our young people had to take to the streets just so that they could protest to be safe in schools when we look at all of the school shootings. And when they all gathered together and started taking to the streets, demanding that we as adults and lawmakers do something to keep them safe in schools, I really felt like, okay, now it's about time, because I didn't feel like they really, really had a movement to get behind. And that happened back in the 60s during the civil rights movement. Young people walked out of school and marched in the streets. And so, again, I think that, there's enough as Mark pointed out, there's enough wrongs to be righted, enough ills that each and every one of us can be and should be doing something to move this movement forward. And for me, I've carved out my own path, and that is with young people. And I think that if they can be taught to be racist, they can be taught not to be. And that's where I put my energy. Because I mean, I know what I was faced with at 6 years old, and I know the thoughts that were going through my mind, and, you know, it shaped me into who I am today. And so I think, to what Mark pointed out, we need to take those young people and we need to turn them into foot soldiers. If I can do it, then if I could have done it back then, they can do it now.
Dr. Fitz?
Yes.
I just add this, it will be absolutely brilliant. People have to vote, and
Yes.
people have to call the question on elected officials. In this moment and in this time, where do you stand and what will you do to use your power as an elected official to be anti-racist, to support public policies that close historic educational, health, and economic gaps? What is your stand? The same way one might ask, what is your stand on fiscal issues? Or what is your stand on climate issues? Or what is your stand on, ask this question. Call the question, demand it of elected officials, but vote and participate. And also, honor when you are, and I think this is particularly the case for people when they're in private settings and private conversations. When people spew out racist stereotype opinions, challenging. Don't sit there and say, I don't want to get in a confrontation. Challenge them. People do have to be made to feel uncomfortable.
Yes.
That, you know, I use the analogy, getting my own analogy, going to school in New Orleans when I was in middle school, and I was at a school where, again, I was only 2 blacks in the entire school. I heard derogatory terminology used about Jews, Italians, and people of Polish descent. And of course, as a black kid, I never heard I didn't know the terms were derogatory initially at the time. But I'd always say, what are these boys gonna say about me behind my back? What are they gonna call me behind my back when they're using these negative terms? And so this whole, you know, climate and culture of racial disparagement and ethnic disparagement and disparagement of people based on their sexual orientation or their religion is corrosive and has to be purged from being acceptable. And people have to be made uncomfortable when they speak like that. And when these people say, well, it's my freedom of speech, and it's your freedom of speech to challenge it. It's your freedom of speech to shut them down.
Yes. Absolutely.
That was a stirring call for activism and reform of our society. Let me say, when I did the presidential speaker series with Justice Sotomayor, I ended asking what gave her hope looking forward in society. Now, I have to say, looking at the two of you, you give me hope, because you clearly, you span the civil rights movement in a sense to some of its beginnings to today, and you've continued that sense of commitment, the sense of dedication. That's why we've had such progress, and why obviously there's still so much more to do, and you were clearly leaders in that effort. But I want to turn to you. What gives you hope?
Well, for me, as I said, what gives me hope is the babies. You know, I'm before this shutdown, I was in a school every day all across the country, and even, you know, had started to travel abroad. And it's amazing, you know, what I would always do is I would try to become the opposition and have the little ones try to convince me to let them in my schools, or to convince me that it doesn't make a difference what we look like. And the analogies that they would come up with was amazing to me. Like one little girl said, well, you know, we're all like M&Ms. We're all different, but when you bite into them, we're all the same inside.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, you know, I felt like immediately, okay, here she is. She's in first grade, but she got it, you know, and that's where we have to start. We have to start, because that is where it starts. It starts in the home. It's passed on from adults, from their parents. And so we have to start very, very early, as Mark said, calling it out, you know, challenging it, explaining why it's not right, you know, and it's an ongoing battle. And probably something that each one of us who are committed to this fight may not live to see what we really want to see. But still, you have to continue the fight, and you have to pass on the torch. And that's what our friend John Lewis did for us. For me, you know, how I feel right now is that, you know, he worked to the end, and so now we have an angel to guide us to the prize. That's how I feel.
Yeah, let me, Dr. Fitz, I do want to, hold on. I lost Ruby. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah.
Did we lose Ruby?
Nope. We're
No,
I'm
I
sorry.
can hear you,
No,
Mark.
I'm sorry that the photo just seemed to get fuzzy for a minute, but there you are. I just want to add this. I want to thank you, Dr. Fitz, and thank Cheryl and the Tulane University community for doing this and for having me, and of course Ruby, and just an honor to be with Ruby and share these reflections. And I agree. What gives me hope is when my 14-year-old daughter about a month ago came to me and said, "Dad, can I go to a protest?" I said, "Of course." And I said, "Is there one you want to go to?" She said, "Oh yeah, and she had all the information. She had it all worked out. She knew exactly where it was, and she wanted to make a sign and put her sign together, and a Black Lives Matter sign." So I took her out there, and she met a friend. She's 14 years old. My son, who's 18, said, "Dad, me and my friends, we're organizing our own protest." So
Wow.
they got together. They organized their own march. It took place not too far from where we live. And this was on their own initiation and their own motion. It's just an example. What gives me hope is the consciousness of the young people.
Absolutely.
The fact that they believe that this work and this fight should be central to their lives. And when it's not forced, it's not encouraged, it's not forced or demanded, it's spontaneous, that's when you have a movement. I hope it persists. And I think young people all across the nation, all across America, and all across the world are indeed embracing this. And it's going to continue. And I think people, we've got a generation that is more activist, We've got a generation that's willing to challenge, and we have to embrace it because we have to create the America and the global community that matches their vision. And I think at this point in my work, in my career, I see myself leading, but I also sometimes see myself following their rhythm and their cadence.
Yes. You're absolutely right, Mark. And it is truly an honor to be a part of this conversation and say that, you know, you've been an example for so many of us, walking in your dad's footsteps, mom. And like you said, you know, when you see that in your own kids, you know, it validates your sacrifices and the work that you've dedicated your life to, you know. And so I just want to say I'm absolutely proud of you.
Thank you.
You know, continue to fight. You know, there's many paths that's going to lead us to the prize, and you know, we may be on different paths, but we're headed in the same direction.
Absolutely. Much
Yeah.
respect.
Thank you.
Thank you both. This has truly been an honor for me, and I know it's been an honor and a real privilege for all the people who've been viewing this conversation. And of course, we've spanned the civil rights movement. We've talked about people at the beginning of last century in the civil rights movement, and here we are talking about its future. And in the end, what gives you both hope is the young. And they are our future. It's their commitment to justice that will move us all forward. So I can't think of two more eloquent spokespeople for this. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Ruby. This has been truly special, I know, for me and everybody who've been part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Continue to fight.
Appreciate it. Keep the faith. Thank you.